Hello, everybody. I am Rachel Donadio, the new administrator of the American Library in Paris Annual Book Award. And I'm very pleased to be speaking today to Maud Casey, one of our 5 finalists this year. And Maud will be talking about her excellent new book, which is called City of Incurable Women. We're a little bit analog here on the Zoom, and I'm holding up the actual book. So Maud is a novelist and writer based in Washington, D.C., and I'm really pleased to talk to you today about the book. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and I'm really deeply honored to be on the list.
Well, we're very delighted to have you on the list. And I want to ask you a little bit about who are these incurable women of which to whom your title refers. Tell us a little bit about where we are and, what is this book about?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe the best way in is to describe how I kind of came to the material, which is historical material, and that is through in the 1980s when I was in college, Georges Didi Uberman's book, The Invention of Hysteria, and that book was very occupied with thinking about the way that Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot in the 19th century sort of resurrected this diagnosis, which was largely to do with the problem, the so-called problem of women's bodies. And one way of really kind of amplifying that or explaining that is that there were a few male hysterics, but for that diagnosis, the problem was outside their body. So if they suffered a trauma, then they might experience hysteria. Whereas for the women, the problem was inside their bodies and had to do with just the fact, really, of being women. And Charcot kind of created a system that was sort of the various stages of hysteria, and in some ways, those stages, one can't know for sure, but this is where my novelist's imagination kind of gets activated. It did seem as though the women and girls, largely poor, often sexually abused, who washed up on the shores of the Salpêtrière, the ones who became kind of the Charcot's best girls, the ones who he presented as case studies in front of large audiences, were the ones who seemed to be both the most photogenic, the ones who were most able to kind of hold a pose, because the photographic technology of the time required the changing of glass plates, which required at least 3 to 5 seconds, which required the women and the girls to hold still and to hold their pose. These were also the ones who were chosen, were also the ones who kind of seemed to best learn the various poses. So that's a long way around kind of giving you some context for the book. And so this history really haunted me. And I think then I got very interested in sort of finding a way to kind of be in impossible conversation with these women and girls long dead. It's not like I thought I was resurrecting their voices, but rather that I was sort of having an impossible conversation across the centuries with these women and girls whose lives really moved me. And I felt certain that, beyond the diagnosis, I mean, even now, diagnoses, which are so important for so many things, they can be quite reductive. And so, how to kind of undo the knot of certainty that is a diagnosis, and kind of allow for particular invented consciousnesses to exist on the page. Yeah.
I think what's so beautiful about this book, City of Incurable Women, is that it is, as you've said in the past, a combination of kind of emotion and fact. You take these often nameless, voiceless women who suffer from a range of ailments, which today might have very different diagnoses than hysteria, and you embody them, you inhabit them, and you kind of delve into their inner lives and speak from that perspective. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, you said this hysteria diagnosis, this is like an ancient idea that this doctor then resurrects in the 19th century. But I wonder if you have a sense of, you could talk a little bit about some of the cases in this book. These women went, as you say, some had been sexually abused, some had had all other kinds of maladies. Like, what, talk a little bit about how you managed to get inside the heads and bodies of these forgotten women.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that lovely description of the book. And I mean, I think again, I was really interested in this combination of kind of a history of feeling alongside a history of fact. And so, I did lots and lots of research. So there are kind of intermingled with invention a lot of details that align with, for instance, Augustine's life. Augustine being kind of one of the most famous, so-called famous hysterics. So there's recognizable details about her life, and in fact, I mean, she was kind of so celebrated that in 1928, when the Surrealists published a manifesto on the 50th anniversary of the diagnosis of hysteria, they reprinted the photographs that Charcot had taken of her as a 15-year-old girl, and the photographs, she's naked, she's against a black backdrop, she's in a bed. They're quite seductive, and they kind of invite you to look. And I think one of the things that I found myself thinking a lot about was my own complicity, my own complicity in looking again, that there's no way out of sort of that voyeuristic quality of the photographs. And so, I mean, actually, one of the stories one of the first stories was me imagining Augustine at the time that manifesto was published by those naughty surrealists, and she would have been in her 60s. And I thought, well, the sort of historical record kind of lost interest in her after she escaped from the Salpêtrière dressed in men's clothing. It was kind of like, okay, that's the end of her story. But I thought, well, what if she was in her 60s and she came across this manifesto? What would she think? And what would that be like? And what would her life be like? And so it was sort of an opportunity to, I mean, I think often of fiction as a kind of possibility space. And when writing fiction that is in relation to history, there's a certain, I feel a certain responsibility in getting certain things right, but I also see the opportunity in, I can't resurrect Augustine, but maybe I can give her a moment, an invented moment, in a book where she burns the journal, for
Hmm.
example.
There's
Um,
so many levels of medical history, cultural history, this hysteria diagnosis, and the fact that these women are studied, photographed, put on display for public audiences to come and see them. I understand what you're talking about, where there's the kind of line between spectacle and then the medical gets blurred. You mentioned photographs. I'm going to hold up in an analog way one of the photographs. And so the doctor Charcot, he photographed these women who he diagnosed as hysterics. And then, but what is this? I mean, this woman has her name written on her back. What exactly are we looking at here?
what
And
are we looking at? It is mysterious in many ways. So there's something called dermographism, which occurs sometimes when a name writing is traced on skin, and this was something that the doctors at the Salpêtrière were very interested in, and interested in inciting. And so they would sometimes write the names of the women, or their names, or the date, in order to kind of see what would happen. And I think, I mean, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but my novelist's imagination kind of imagines that there was an element of wanting to please there too. I mean, these women, these girls, I keep saying girls, I think because some of them were so very young. You know, they were there sometimes under duress, but also, a lot of things had happened to them that caused pain. And then here they were in a situation where to please the doctors was to be rewarded.
Mm.
And it created this kind of very complex situation with a lot of questions. And I think for me as a novelist, that's where my mind goes, to the questions that are kind of unanswerable, but that I can meditate on over the course of a book.
Where are we in the history of the evolution of psychology, psychiatry, mental illness? I mean, hysteria is just this catch-all term, and as you say, these women and girls had a range of ailments. They were victims. They also had some kind of agency. That's what you're talking about as a novelist. You're exploring. But tell us a little bit about, when the Dr. Charcot gave this diagnosis, and these women were studied. Where are we exactly in, the evolution of our thinking on mental illness?
It is a very big question, and I won't
I'm
I
just
won't
throwing out a
pretend
little
I
shortened.
won't pretend I have the answer. Although, I mean, I think it's this book. I think as I was finishing up, it felt enormously relevant. I mean, certainly, what's happening, in the United States vis-a-vis abortion rights. There's a sense of wanting to control women's bodies that persists, and certainly in psychiatry. I think that underlying sense of something's wrong with women's bodies also persists. I mean, I would also say that obviously there's been an enormous amount of progress, for which I think everyone is really grateful. But diagnoses are a story, and I think that's important, to consider. And it's a social science. It's not hard science. And sometimes I think it's a social science disguised as a hard science. And that's where things get tricky. And this is something I turn to Ian Hacking a lot for his thinking on this subject. He wrote a really wonderful article in the London Review of Books when there was the big kerfuffle around kind of whatever edition it was of the diagnostic manual. And one of the things he said about it was that it gets the fundamental nature of things wrong. And I think about that a lot. I mean, because it makes you think, well, what is the fundamental nature of things? But it also makes you think, it reminds you that psychiatry is not a hard science. It's a social science that had to kind of present itself as a hard science in the beginning in order to be taken seriously.
It's interesting. And also, I mean, this era of the hysteria diagnosis, the women that you talk about in this book, which is a fictionalized, imaginative account of the inner lives of these women who were diagnosed as hysterics. Some of the things that led to that diagnosis, there was like reading too much, or, I mean, tell us about some of the things that were kind of thrown into that catch all term in the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, you name it. I mean, reading too much, masturbation, drinking. I mean, I want to say thinking, because that was probably on the list too. Anything. I mean, there were any number of things, and all of them kind of led back to the problem of the so-called problem of being in a woman's body. I mean, when you think about some of the things that went down in the name of kind of understanding this diagnosis, there was ovarian adjustment. There's something called an ovarian adjustment belt. I mean, it was really there was a kind of fixation with reproductive organs, with the bodies of women, and a kind of effort to solve them. And I think one of the things fiction does is, and here this is not mine, it's Chekhov's, and I'll probably misquote him, but the obligation of the writer is not to articulate the answers, but to articulate the questions. And again, I mean, I think particularly with this material, there were so many questions, some of which I felt I could kind of I could be in a kind of argument across the years, and I'm deeply moved by these historical figures, and also there are questions that existed, in that moment between the women and the doctors that I will never be able to answer, but to kind of meditate on them is generative. And I hope that that's true for readers as well.
What are some of the questions that you feel you've posed in this book, City of Incurable Women, about the women diagnosed as hysterics at the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in Paris in the 19th century?
Well, I think a big one for me is related to that idea of undoing the knot of certainty that a diagnosis creates. And so, I mean, one of the questions is, what is it to be human in a woman's body? What is it? What else is going on? How are we inscrutable to one another? I'm really interested in the way that fiction can kind of meditate on, invite us into the mystery of the self, whatever that is, whatever big kind of mess that is. And so that idea of fiction being sort of the province of consciousness. I mean, there's the sense that we can all know each other approximately, but when you read fiction, you are often being invited into the secret life that you just you never have access to, even with your most beloved. So that's what excites me. And so with these characters who were inspired by, in conversation with historical figures, I think part of it was I wanted to return their inscrutability to them. I mean, it's an impossible thing. I can't, but I can suggest that they had their mystery too.
Mhm. The American Library in Paris Annual Book Award is for a book that talks about the French culture, French people, France, French language. And I think one of the things that is so interesting about this phenomenon in in your book, and the phenomenon you talk about, the hysteria diagnosis, this doctor Charcot at the Pitié-Salpêtrière, is really this impulse for the scientific, the empirical, we need to understand things. And then also this kind of highly politicized, women's bodies are always battlegrounds, right? And they have been, since then. And then also this kind of clash between, it's like the medical history, the performative aspect, the femininity, and French femininity is a whole other construct. And then also the history of mental illness and the diagnosis. And so I felt like this kind of brought together so many things that to me are very much a part of French intellectual history. I don't think that this hospital, this study might have been done elsewhere. I could be wrong, but I feel like there's something kind of very French about all of these concepts that you're exploring. What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, I definitely, yes to all that you're saying, and I want to sort of back up a little bit with Charcot, because one of the things about him was that he was a neurologist, and he was a neurologist before he began kind of rummaging around in hysteria. So this is also the story of kind of these this moment in the kind of burgeoning field of psychiatry, which was really happening in France, and was sort of the nexus, and it was growing out of these very real advancements in hard science, and then this kind of turn happening, and I don't know, I don't think that was specific to Charcot. I think that had to do with a sort of with the problem of femininity, with the problem of women kind of, perhaps becoming more I mean, powerful might be too strong a word, but sort of the evolution of women in the French culture, and so it's a very cuspy moment, because it's also, Charcot was Freud's teacher, so we're on the cusp of Freud, and all that unleashed. But yeah, no, I really appreciate your reading of it.
Femininity is a diagnosis, right? Not just hysteria. It's like the problem of womanhood. It must be solved. But it really is such an interesting moment, a hinge moment between the 19th and the 20th century, and then the way that you, as a novelist, embody these women with this question that you're now saying, which is like diagnosis is a social construct, right? That's kind of
Yeah,
where you're going with that. So
yeah, yeah,
applicable today a little.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of diagnoses that have kind of arisen and then faded away, and part of that has to do with, diagnoses arise not in a vacuum, but in a particular culture, in a particular moment, for all kinds of political reasons. And I mean, when Charcot died, the diagnosis died with him. And one of the women whose story I draw from in the book, her the historical facts of her life, I include some of them, which is she was a big figure in the theater of hysteria, and when Charcot died, she ended up as working in the radiology lab at the Salpêtrière, where she lost her arm kind of bit by bit to radiation poisoning, and was mostly scorned by people who thought she was kind of, her moment had passed because hysteria was over.
Oh.
So that the end of hysteria is also very interesting too. I mean, it had a lot to do with Charcot's presence and his charisma, maybe even with his pet monkey.
There's everything in this book.
There's
That's a
everything.
really it's a fascinating chapter. Is there anything else that you hope people will take away from your book, City of Incurable Women? Anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, I think one of the interesting things as I was working on this book was, I just, as I got deeper and deeper into the research, I just assumed everybody knew these stories. And what I learned since is they're not well known necessarily. And so while this is not an historical book, it is fiction, maybe there's a way that it will also kind of shine a light, illuminate this sort of dark corner of history that maybe isn't as well known as I assumed it was.
Never assume anything, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Well, Maud Casey, it's been a pleasure talking to you about City of Incurable Women, one of the 5 finalists of this year's annual American Library in Paris Book Award. And thank you so much for the beautiful book.
Thank you so much for all the time you've taken, and I really am, again, I'm really, really delighted and honored to be on the list.